The road bull didn't care about the 6 months of planning or the 300 miles of sweat Kendrick Thompson had poured into this range. All it saw was a man standing between it and the open scrubland of the Nevada high desert. Kendrick's boots slipped on the dry, shifting silt as the beast lowered its head, 1,800 pounds of muscle and raw fury ready to trample him into the dust. He gripped his heavy rope, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and for a split second, he wondered if this was how it ended, alone on a patch of earth that didn't know his name. Then, a massive blur of tan and white muscle exploded from the sagebrush. It wasn't a man, and it wasn't a horse. It was a creature that moved with the silent, terrifying grace of a mountain lion, but possessed the booming, guttural roar of a thunderstorm. The Anatolian Shepherd didn't bark. He challenged. He placed himself directly between the bull and the man, his hackles raised like a serrated blade, his intelligent brown eyes locked on the beast. The bull hesitated, its momentum broken by a presence it didn't understand. In that silence, the world shifted. Kendrick looked at the dog, then at the woman standing further back, her auburn hair catching the dying light of the sun, and he realized that the stranger he'd invited into his life had brought more than just a suitcase. She'd brought his survival. But to understand how Kendrick Thompson ended up cornered by a bull with a 100-pound beast as his only ally, we have to go back to a Tuesday morning in June 1876, when the heat was already shimmering off the packed earth of Main Street in Hawthorne, Nevada. The telegram had been short, tucked into Kendrick's vest pocket by weathered fingers that trembled more from anticipation than the dry desert wind. Asterisk arriving Thursday. Name is Winifred Harper. Bringing dog. Hope acceptable. Asterisk Kendrick had read those words until the ink began to smudge. At 29, he was a man of the earth, built from the grit of 8 years of solitary labor. He had carved a ranch out of nothing, expanding his father's original 3-room cabin into a solid 2-story structure of wood and stone. He owned 300 head of cattle and enough land to make a man proud. But his most constant companion was a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. His older brother had been the one to suggest the mail-order bride arrangement. He'd watched Kendrick eat too many silent suppers in a house that felt like a tomb. Loneliness is a slow-acting poison on the frontier. It eats away at a man's spirit until he forgets the sound of his own voice. Kendrick wasn't a man for courting. He could manage a stampede or navigate a drought, but the thought of sitting in a parlor making polite conversation with a woman while her parents watched terrified him. So, he had placed the advertisement. He wanted a partner, someone who understood that the land was hard and the work was harder. He had written 4 letters to Winifred Harper. Each one felt stilted, filled with awkward paragraphs about cattle prices and the unpredictability of Nevada weather. She had replied with an honesty that had reached across the miles and touched something buried deep inside him. She was 24, educated, and looking for a fresh start after her family had died in a fire back in Pennsylvania. She didn't ask for luxury. She asked for a place to belong. The mention of a dog had caught him off guard, but as the train whistle sounded in the distance on that fateful Thursday, a lonely wail that seemed to echo Kendrick's own heart, he found himself almost smiling. His last herding dog, an aging border collie named Skip, had died the previous autumn. Moving the cattle across the rocky, unforgiving terrain of the high desert had become an exhausting game of inches. A dog could do the work of 3 men if it had the right instinct. As the locomotive pulled into the station with a great hissing of steam and the screeching of iron brakes, Kendrick stood on the platform, his stomach twisting. He tried to tame his dark, unruly hair with water and a comb, and he'd shave his jaw until it was smooth, but he still felt like a rough-hewn stranger compared to the world Winifred was coming from. She was the 4th person off the train. Kendrick knew her instantly. The photograph she'd sent hadn't prepared him for the clarity in her green eyes or the way she held her chin high, refusing to apologize for the space she occupied. She wore a practical, gray, traveling dress and a simple bonnet. But it was what she held in her arms that drew the eyes of everyone on the platform. It was a beast. A leather lead was wrapped around her hand, and at the end of it sat a dog so large Kendrick's first thought was that she'd brought a wolf. The animal was easily 80 pounds of muscle and thick, cream-colored fur. It sat with a dignified, alert stillness, its intelligent eyes sweeping the station as if assessing every possible threat. "Mr. Thompson," she said. Her voice wasn't a timid whisper. It was clear and direct, cutting through the noise of the station. Kendrick removed his hat, the sun beating down on his head. "Miss Harper, welcome to Hawthorne." She gestured to the massive dog at her side. "This is Bear. He is an Anatolian Shepherd. My father bred them for protecting livestock in the East. I know I should have explained in more detail, but I was afraid you would refuse if you knew how large he was. I could not leave him behind. He is all I have left." There was a crack in her voice on those last words, a glimpse of the raw grief that lived behind her composed expression. Kendrick looked at the woman who had traveled 2,000 miles with nothing but a trunk and a dog, and he felt a surge of respect that went deeper than anything he'd felt in years. Most people scroll past a story of struggle, but those with true frontier spirit stay to see the end. Kendrick knelt slowly, extending a hand. Bear didn't growl. He sniffed Kendrick's fingers with a steady, calculating gaze, then gave them a tentative lick. It was a seal of approval from a judge that didn't know how to lie. "Good," Kendrick said, standing up and meeting Winifred's surprised gaze. "I need a herding partner. My last dog died, and the cattle have been running wild without proper management. If he's as smart as he looks, we can use him." The relief that flooded her face transformed her completely. For a moment, the weight of her past seemed to lift, revealing a beauty that made Kendrick's heart skip a beat. "He is very smart," she assured him. "He's been trained since puppyhood to guard. Cattle shouldn't be much different." "We'll find out," Kendrick said. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes, and the silence between them was different now. Not the heavy silence of loneliness, but the quiet of two people measuring each other. Bear rode in the wagon bed, his head held high as he watched the sage-covered hills roll by. "It's very open," Winifred said finally, looking out at the distant purple mountains. "I can see for miles. Back home, everything was trees and hills. You could never see danger until it was upon you." Kendrick didn't press her on the danger she meant. He knew about the fire, but he sensed there were other scars she wasn't ready to show. He pointed out the boundaries of his 300 acres as they crossed the creek, the water source that made the land valuable even in the driest years. The house came into view, a solid testament to his survival, with a wide porch designed to catch the morning sun. When they arrived, his two ranch hands, Hector and young Pete, emerged from the barn. They both stopped dead at the sight of Bear jumping down from the wagon. "That is quite a dog you have there, madam," young Pete said, tipping his hat with a grin. "His name is Bear," Winifred said, her voice regaining its strength. "And he's here to work. We need the help," Hector added in his steady, weathered tone. "The cattle, they have been difficult this season. Too spread out." Kendrick showed Winifred into the house. It was clean but sparse. A man's house, filled with only the necessities. He carried her trunk upstairs to the room he'd prepared. He'd even put a jar of wildflowers on the small table by the window, a gesture that felt foolish until he saw her expression soften when she noticed them. "Thank you, Kendrick," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted you to feel welcome," he replied, feeling that familiar awkwardness return. "I know this isn't what you're used to." She turned to face him, her green eyes burning with a sudden intensity. "Kendrick, I am not some delicate flower who will wilt at the first sign of hardship. I worked in a boarding house for 6 months, scrubbing floors and washing linens, just to save enough to answer your advertisement. This house, this room, this chance at a real life again, is more than I dared hope for." Her honesty disarmed him. In that moment, the distance between them vanished. They weren't just a rancher and a mail-order bride. They were two people who had looked into the abyss of loss and decided to keep walking. That night, they ate a simple meal of beans and fresh bread that Winifred had managed to whip up in a kitchen she didn't know. After supper, they stood together on the porch, watching the sun set and the desert sky turn into a canvas of fire. Bear sat at their feet, his tail thumping softly against the wood. "The Reverend in town can marry us Saturday, if you're ready," Kendrick said. "I don't want to rush you." Winifred watched the horizon for a long time. I came here to be your partner, Kendrick, not just your cook. I want to help with everything, the branding, the sorting, the range. I don't need time to settle in. I'm ready. Kendrick felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. He looked at the vast, unregulated frontier before them and knew that for the first time in his life, he didn't have to face it alone. But as the stars began to poke through the darkening sky, Kendrick noticed Winifred looking toward the east. He wondered if she was thinking of the family she'd lost, or if there was a secret she was still guarding as closely as Bear guarded her. The frontier doesn't just test your strength, it tests your secrets. And Kendrick was beginning to realize that the most dangerous things in Nevada weren't the rogue bulls or the droughts. They were the things we carry with us from the places we've left behind. If you are ready for this epic journey, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from, hit the like button, subscribe to Redwood Chronicle, and turn on notifications so you never miss more of our upcoming videos. Most people will click away before the real story begins, but I can tell you the kind of person who knows that the best parts of life require a little grit to reach. The first morning didn't come with a fanfare. It came with the smell of wood smoke and the sharp, bright tang of Arbuckle's coffee. Kendrick woke before the sun had even managed to crest the Sierra Peaks, expecting the usual hollow quiet of his bedroom. Instead, he heard the muted clatter of a skillet downstairs and the low, rhythmic thumping of a tail against the floorboards. For a second, he lay there, staring at the rafters, the reality of the previous day settling into his bones. He wasn't alone. When he reached the kitchen, the sight stopped him in the doorway. Winifred was already there, her auburn hair braided neatly down her back, wearing a simple blue work dress that looked like it had seen better days but was meticulously clean. She was leaning over the wood stove, flipping biscuits with a practiced hand. Bear sat near the hearth, his massive head resting on his paws, watching her with a devotion that was almost palpable. "You didn't have to get up so early," Kendrick said, his voice still rough with sleep. Winnie didn't startle. She turned, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "If I'm going to be a rancher's wife, Kendrick, I need to keep a rancher's hours. Besides, the air is best at this hour." It reminded me of the mornings back home before everything changed. She handed him a tin cup of coffee. It was stronger than he usually made it and better. As he drank, he watched her move. There was a directness to her actions, a lack of wasted motion that he admired. The frontier chewed up people who spent too much time thinking about doing a task instead of just doing it. Winnie, it seemed, was a doer. "I want to see what Bear can do today," she said, her green eyes meeting his. "I know you're skeptical. You see a pet, a companion. But my father didn't raise pets. He raised guardians. He used to say that Anatolians are thinking dogs. They don't just react, they assess. If you give them a job, they'll find the most efficient way to do it." Kendrick nodded, though his mind was already jumping to the logistics. "We've got about 20 head of mixed steers in the near corral. They're jumpy after the move. It's a small enough group to test him without losing half the herd if he decides to just chase them for sport. He won't chase them," Winnie said firmly. "Chasing is for curs. Bear knows the difference between a threat and a responsibility." After a quick breakfast, they walked out into the crisp morning air. The desert was still holding on to the night's chill, the sagebrush silvered with a light coating of frost. Hector and young Pete were already at the corrals, leaning against the fence rails with a look of mild amusement. They had spent their lives around cattle dogs, border collies, and heelers that were quick, nippy, and loud. The idea of a 100-pound beast that looked like it belonged in a bear den actually herding cattle was a joke to them. "Ready to see the circus, boss?" Young Pete called out, tipping his hat to Winnie. "Watch and learn, Pete," Kendrick replied, though his own heart was thumping with a nervous uncertainty. The 20 head of cattle were milling about, their breath visible in the cold air. They were a motley crew, red and white hides, spreading horns, and a collective attitude that said they'd rather be anywhere but in a confined space. Kendrick gestured to the far side of the corral. "Can you have him move them over there?" Into the holding pen. Winnie didn't shout. She didn't whistle. She stepped up to the rail, Bear at her side, and spoke in a language that was low and melodic, a tongue Kendrick didn't recognize, but Bear clearly did. The dog's ears perked forward. He didn't explode into a run. He moved with a slow, deliberate trot, circling wide around the perimeter of the cattle. The steers noticed him immediately. They bunched together, eyes wide, expecting a flurry of barking and nipping at their heels. But Bear did neither. He simply walked. He used his body position, his sheer mass, and a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air. He was a wall of presence. When a steer tried to break toward the fence, Bear didn't chase. He simply shifted his weight, cutting off the angle before the animal had even committed to the move. It was a dance of intimidation. Within minutes, the cattle were moving as a single unit, perfectly funneled toward the holding pen. Bear sat down the moment the last tail passed through the gate, his tongue lolling, waiting for the next word. Hector let out a low whistle, pushing his hat back. I've never seen a dog move like that. He didn't even touch them. It was like he was just convincing them they want to go that way. Intimidation rather than force, Winnie explained, her pride evident but controlled. They were bred to stand down wolves. A steer is just a bigger target that needs a bit of direction. Kendrick looked at the dog, then at Winnie. The realization hit him then. The headline hadn't been a warning. It had been a promise. He had been so focused on what he would have to provide for her that he hadn't fully considered what she was bringing to him. The gather is coming up in late July, Kendrick said, turning to his men. We've got 300 heads scattered across the summer range. If Bear can do that in the open country, we might actually finish the branding before the heat turns lethal. If he can handle the brush, Hector noted, his eyes still on Bear. The high desert isn't a flat corral, boss. He can handle it, Winnie said, and Kendrick believed her. But there was another challenge to address. If Winnie was going to be his partner on the range, she needed more than just a dog. She needed to ride. Not the polite, side-saddle riding of an Eastern socialite, but the grit and leather riding of a Nevada ranch hand. You said you ride, Kendrick said, gesturing to the stables. I learned as a girl, she replied. But I imagine your Nevada horses have a different idea of what riding means than the ones back in Pennsylvania. They spent the next 3 hours at the mounting block. Kendrick brought out a steady bay gelding named Rusty. He watched as Winnie approached the animal. She didn't hesitate. She spoke to the horse the same way she spoke to Bear, with an authority that expected obedience but offered respect. The Western saddle is a tool, not a seat, Kendrick explained as he helped her adjust the stirrups. You ride with your weight and your legs. If you fight the horse, the desert will win. You have to move with him. She sat awkwardly at first, her body used to a different balance. But she was a quick study. She had a natural sense of rhythm, a way of feeling the horse's intent through the leather. They rode out toward the creek, Bear loping tirelessly alongside them. Have you ever felt like you were meant for a place you'd never seen? Winnie asked as they stopped to let the horses drink. The cottonwood trees were rustling, their leaves like thousands of tiny green flags. Kendrick looked at her. Her face was flushed with the exertion, a few strands of auburn hair escaping her braid. She looked more at home in this harsh, beautiful landscape than he'd expected. I think some people are born with the desert in their blood, he said, even if they don't know it until they get here. I was terrified on the train, she admitted, her voice dropping. I spent 6 months scrubbing floors, saving every penny, wondering if I was throwing my life away on a dream that would turn into a nightmare. I've lost everything once, Kendrick. I don't know if I have the strength to do it again. She was talking about more than just the ranch. She was talking about the risk of their arrangement, the vulnerability of tying her fate to a man she'd known for less than 48 hours. I'm not going to tell you it's easy, Kendrick said, stepping closer. The weather is cruel, the work is endless, and there are men in this territory who would take everything you have if they could. But I built this ranch to last, and I chose you because I thought you were the kind of woman who could help me make sure it does. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he took hers. Her fingers were small but strong, the skin already beginning to roughen from the work. We're partners, Winnie. That means we share the risk. And the reward. She squeezed his hand, and for a moment, the vastness of the Nevada territory didn't feel so overwhelming. But as they turned to ride back, a shadow crossed Kendrick's mind. He'd heard rumors in town about a group of rustlers moving through the northern valley. They were professional, ruthless, and they targeted isolated ranches. Kendrick looked at his 300 head of cattle, his life's work, and then at Winnie. He had more to lose now than he'd ever had before. Have you ever felt the weight of being underestimated? Or have you had a moment where you finally realized your true worth? Leave a comment below and share your story. We read every single one because this channel isn't just about stories, it's about the grit we all carry. If you believe that loyalty is the ultimate frontier virtue, hit that like button. Saturday morning arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted. Kendrick stood in front of the small mirror in his bedroom, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar buttons of his Sunday suit. The room smelled faintly of cedar and the lavender water Winifred had used in her room across the hall. He had spent his life in denim and flannel, and the stiff collar felt like a noose. But when he caught his reflection, he didn't see the lonely rancher who had spent 8 years talking to himself. He saw a man on the precipice of a new life. He heard the soft rustle of silk in the hallway, and his heart hammered against his ribs. The door opened, and Winifred stepped out. She wore a simple blue dress, the color of the Nevada sky, just before twilight. She had pinned her auburn hair up with small white flowers she'd found growing near the creek. She looked like a dream that had somehow wandered into the dust of the high desert. "Mr. Thompson," she said, a playful spark in her green eyes. "Kendrick," he corrected, his voice sounding thick even to his own ears. "You look more beautiful than any photograph could ever say." She smiled, a soft, genuine expression that made the dimples in her cheeks deepen. "Thank you. I think I'm ready." The ride into Hawthorne was different this time. They sat close on the wagon seat, the space between them charged with a nervous energy. Bear sat in the wagon bed, his head held high, his intelligent eyes scanning the horizon. He seemed to know that today was important. The small church on the edge of town was quiet. The only sound the distant whistle of the Sacramento train and the rustle of the sagebrush in the wind. Hector and young Pete were already there, standing awkwardly in their best clothes. The Reverend's wife sat at the old, upright piano, playing a melody that sounded both familiar and strange in this remote corner of the world. The ceremony was brief. Kendrick felt the weight of the gold band as he slid it onto Winifred's finger. Her hand was steady, her grip firm. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Kendrick kissed her carefully, a chaste brush of lips that sent a warmth spreading through his chest that he knew would never fully fade. "I have you now," he whispered as they walked out into the bright sunlight. "And I have you," she replied. They had lunch at the hotel restaurant, a rare extravagance that drew the eyes of the townspeople. Kendrick could feel the judgment, the whispered questions about a man who had to send for a bride from 2,000 miles away. But he didn't care. He looked at Winnie, who held her head high and spoke to the sheriff with a polite warmth that seemed to disarm him. "You've got quite an animal there, Mrs. Thompson," the sheriff said, scratching Bear behind the ears. "He's my guardian," she said, her hand resting on the dog's broad head. "And he's part of this ranch now." The ride back to the ranch was a study in transition. The gold band on Winifred's finger caught the light as she held the reins, a silent testament to the covenant they'd made. The silence between them was no longer the quiet of strangers, but the peace of two people who had decided to build something together. "The gather starts Monday," Kendrick said as they approached the creek. "It's going to be hard work, Winnie. Long days in the saddle, searching every canyon for strays. Are you sure you're ready?" She looked at him, her green eyes burning with a sudden intensity. "I didn't come here to sit in the house while you do all the work, Kendrick. I want to be your partner. I want to help with the branding, the sorting, everything. That's what a marriage is, isn't it? Two people working toward a common goal." Kendrick felt a deepening respect for this woman who refused to be sidelined. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is exactly what it should be." That night, after the meal had been cleared away, there was an awkward moment at the bottom of the stairs. Kendrick cleared his throat, his heart beating hard. "Winnie, I want you to know that I don't expect anything you aren't ready to give. We're married, yes, but we're still strangers in many ways. You can keep your room, and I'll keep mine, until until you feel otherwise. Winifred studied his face in the lamplight. You're a good man, Kendrick Thompson. Better than I had any right to hope for. She stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek, her lips soft against his skin. Good night. He watched her climb the stairs, Bear following close behind her. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house, settling and wondering what the woman across the hall was thinking. He knew that the hardest part of the frontier wasn't the work. It was the slow, steady build of trust. But as the wind picked up, rattling the shutters of the old ranch house, Kendrick felt a sudden, sharp fear. The rustlers were still out there, and he knew that they would be watching. He had more to lose now than just his cattle. He had his life, and he had Winifred. Have you ever taken a risk on something or someone that everyone else said was a mistake? Or have you had a moment where you stood tall while others whispered behind your back? Leave a comment below and share your story. We want to know the grit that keeps you going even when the wind is at your back. If you believe that trust is the real gold on the frontier, hit that like button. Monday morning did not break with the gentle warmth of the weekend. It arrived with a sharp, biting frost that turned the Nevada high desert into a world of silver and glass. Kendrick stood on the porch, the air crystalline in his lungs, watching the horse's breath huff out in rhythmic white clouds. The gather was the most brutal part of the rancher's calendar. It was a week of relentless dust, aching muscles, and the constant, nagging fear that a single misstep in a rocky canyon could end a horse's life or a man's. Behind him, the door creaked open. He expected young Pete or Hector, but instead, it was Winnie. She was dressed in a sturdy canvas coat, her auburn hair tucked tightly beneath a wide-brimmed felt hat. She carried 2 heavy leather saddlebags, the scent of fresh-baked biscuits and dried beef trailing behind her. I told you I was coming, she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the early morning hush. Kendrick looked at her, then at the vast, indigo silhouette of the mountains where his 300 head of cattle were hidden in the folds of the earth. Winnie, the high range isn't the valley floor. The trails are narrow, the sagebrush is thick enough to trip a mule, and the cattle out there, they haven't seen a human in months. They're wilder than you can imagine. Winnie walked to her bay gelding, Rusty, and began checking the cinch with a confidence that made Kendrick's protestations feel small. I'm a Thompson now, Kendrick, and as you said, the land belongs to both of us. If we're to build a legacy, I will not do it from the safety of the kitchen window. Bear emerged from the shadows of the porch, his massive head held high, his intelligent eyes already fixed on the distant hills. He seemed to know that the games of the corral were over. This was the work he was bred for, the protection of the flock, the navigation of the wild. They rode out just as the sun began to bleed orange across the horizon. The silence of the desert was deceptive. Beneath the stillness, the land was a living, breathing thing. Every rustle of the sage, every cry of a distant hawk was a signal. Kendrick led the way, with Hector and young Pete flanking the perimeter. Winnie and Bear brought up the rear, a position Kendrick had chosen to keep her safe, though he soon realized she didn't need the protection. By midday, the heat had replaced the frost, a shimmering, heavy weight that settled into the rider's shoulders. They had found a first group, 40 head of mixed steers and cows huddling in a shaded draw. The animals were skittish, their eyes rolling white as they caught the scent of the riders. Watch this, Hector murmured, nodding toward Bear. The massive dog didn't wait for a whistle. He moved with a low, predatory trot, circling the draw with a precision that bordered on the uncanny. He didn't bark, he didn't snap. He simply existed in the exact space the cattle wanted to occupy. When a young bull tried to break for the high rocks, Bear was there, a tan and white wall of muscle. He lowered his head and let out a rumble that Kendrick could feel in the soles of his boots. The bull skidded to a halt, the dust billowing around its hooves, and turned back toward the herd. He doesn't herd them, young Pete marveled. He convinces them. They worked through the afternoon, the numbers growing. 50 head, then 80, then 100. The physical toll was immense. Kendrick watched Winnie. Her face was covered in a fine layer of alkaline dust. Her hands were red from the rains, and her back was surely screaming from the unfamiliar hours in the saddle. But every time their eyes met, she offered him a small, determined nod. She wasn't just surviving the day, she was mastering it. They made camp in a protected canyon as the stars began to poke through the deepening violet of the sky. The horses were rubbed down and fed. The fire was built into a steady, comforting glow, and for a moment, the harshness of the frontier felt like a distant memory. Winnie sat by the fire, her legs stretched out, Bear's head resting on her knee. "My father always said that the land gives you back exactly what you put into it," she said softly, staring into the embers. "He spent his life saving animals that most people would have left to die. He believed that everything, a horse, a dog, a person, deserved a second chance if they were willing to work for it." Kendrick leaned against a rock, his coffee tin warm in his hands. "Is that why you came, Winnie? For a second chance?" She was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the wood and the distant, lonely wail of a coyote. After the fire, there was nothing left but ghosts. I worked in that boarding house, and I could feel myself disappearing. I was a name on a ledger, a pair of hands that scrubbed floors. I didn't want a husband just to have a roof over my head. I wanted a husband who would see me. Really see me. She looked at him then, her green eyes bright in the firelight. "You didn't ask me for a cook or a housekeeper in your letters, Kendrick. You asked for a partner. You were the only man who understood that a woman could be more than just a decoration in a parlor." Kendrick felt a deepening of the connection he'd been feeling since the platform in Hawthorne. It wasn't just the attraction of two people thrown together by circumstance. It was the recognition of two survivors. "I was alone for 8 years, Kendrick admitted, his voice dropping. "I built the walls of that house with my own hands, but it was never a home. I thought I was strong enough to face the desert alone. I was wrong." He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were rough now, the skin callous from the day's labor, but to Kendrick, they were the most beautiful thing he had ever felt. "I chose you because I saw the grit in your letters. And I keep choosing you every day because I see the heart behind it." But the peace of the camp was shattered just after midnight. Bear, who had been sleeping soundly, suddenly bolted upright. His hackles were raised, a low, murderous growl vibrating in his chest. Kendrick was on his feet in a second, his rifle in hand. "Hector! Pete! Up!" In the distance, they heard it, the rhythmic thud of hooves that didn't belong to their herd. A group of riders was moving fast along the ridgeline. The rustlers. They hadn't come for a few head. They had come for the entire gather. "Stay behind the rocks," Kendrick commanded Winnie, but he already knew the answer. She was already checking her own rifle, her face pale, but her hands steady. "We're partners, Kendrick. Remember? The frontier is a place of hard truths and sudden violence." As the moon dipped behind the peaks, leaving the canyon in a cloak of silver and shadow, Kendrick realized that the gather was no longer about cattle. It was about survival. It was about the life they were building together, and the beast that stood as their only guardian against the dark. Have you ever had a moment where you had to stand your ground against something that terrified you? Or have you ever found strength in a partner when you thought you were at your breaking point? Leave a comment below and share your story. This channel is a community of the resilient, and your voice matters. If you believe that a partner is the ultimate defense against the world, hit that like button. The night air in the canyon was thick with the scent of damp sage and the metallic tang of impending conflict. Kendrick Thompson crouched low behind a granite outcropping, his fingers numb against the cold steel of his Winchester. Every sense he possessed was tuned to the darkness beyond their campfire, which Hector had quickly smothered into a smoldering pile of ash. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of his horses and the low, guttural rumble continuing to vibrate from Bear's chest. "They're circling to the west," Hector whispered, his voice barely a breath in the wind. "They want to drive the cattle out of the draw. If they hit the flats, we'll never see those steers again." Kendrick glanced at Winnie. She was positioned 20 feet to his right, her silhouette sharp against the starlit rocks. She wasn't trembling. She held her father's old Henry rifle with a familiarity that chilled him and comforted him all at once. He had wanted to send her back east to safety, but as he looked at her now, dust-covered, determined, and lethal, he realized that the woman he'd married was forged from the same iron as this land. "Bear, quiet," Winnie commanded, her voice a low, silk thread. The massive dog ceased his growling instantly, though his body remained taut as a drawn bowstring. He didn't need to be told where the threat was. He was an Anatolian Shepherd, a guardian by blood and ancient instinct. He knew the scent of a predator, whether it wore fur or denim. Suddenly, a gunshot shattered the silence, a sharp, cracking report that echoed off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. The cattle in the draw below erupted into a panicked mass of lowing and clattering hooves. "Stampede," young Pete shouted, already mounting his horse to try and head off the lead steers. "Stay down," Kendrick roared, but it was too late for caution. 3 riders exploded from the ridge line, their silhouettes flashing against the moon as they fired into the air, trying to spook the herd into a blind run toward the valley floor. They weren't just rustlers. They were professional thieves who knew that a panicked herd was easier to steal than a settled one. Kendrick to the left. Winnie's voice rang out that a rider was bearing down on their camp, his face obscured by a dark kerchief, his revolver spitting fire. Kendrick returned the shot, the recoil jarring his shoulder, but the rider was fast, dipping low behind his horse's neck. Before Kendrick could chamber another round, a massive tan shadow launched itself from the rocks. Bear didn't bark. He didn't snarl. He simply hit the horse and rider with the force of a falling tree. The horse reared, its eyes wide with terror at the sight of the beast that looked like a wolf from a nightmare. The rider was thrown from the saddle, tumbling into the rocky silt. Bear was on him in an instant. He didn't tear at the man's throat. He pinned him. He stood over the rustler, his massive jaws inches from the man's face, a rumble in his chest that seemed to vibrate the very ground they stood on. The rustler froze, his eyes bulging with a fear that transcended logic. He knew that if he moved a muscle, Bear would end his life. "Don't shoot," the man screamed, his voice cracking. "Call him off. For the love of God, call him off." Winnie stepped from the shadows, her rifle leveled at the man's chest. "Bear, hold," she said, her voice steady and cold. The dog remained a statue of cream-colored muscle, his eyes never leaving the man's throat. Kendrick moved quickly, securing the man's hands with a leather thong. Meanwhile, Hector and young Pete had managed to turn the lead steers, the cattle milling in a confused circle rather than breaking for the open desert. The other 2 rustlers, seeing their partner pinned by a beast and their escape route blocked by armed men, turned their horses and fled into the darkness toward the northern pass. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the settling dust and the distant, fading hoofbeats of the retreating thieves. Kendrick walked over to Winnie, his heart finally beginning to slow its frantic pace. "You did it," he whispered, looking at her with a mix of awe and a new, deeper kind of love. "You and Bear saved the ranch." Winnie lowered her rifle, her shoulders finally sagging as the adrenaline began to fade. She looked at the rustler on the ground, then at her dog. "He's just doing what he was bred for, Kendrick. Protecting his flock. And we are his flock now." They brought the prisoner back to the main ranch as the first fingers of dawn began to paint the Sierra peaks in shades of pale rose and gold. The ride was a quiet affair. Kendrick rode next to Winnie, their stirrups occasionally brushing, a silent language of connection passing between them. He realized then that the mail order bride came with a dog headline was just the surface of the story. The truth was that 2 survivors had found each other, and in doing so, they had built a fortress that no thief could breach. When they reached the ranch, the sheriff from Hawthorne was already there, his horse lathered and tired. He'd heard the rumors of the rustlers and had ridden through the night to warn the Thompsons. "Looks like I'm late to the party," Kendrick, Sheriff Crawford said, his grizzled face breaking into a grin as he saw the prisoner draped across Hector's spare horse. "You missed the main event, Tom," Kendrick replied, gesturing to Bear, who was currently receiving a vigorous ear-scratching from young Pete. "That dog probably saved us a dozen head or more, and captured this one to boot." The sheriff walked over to Bear, whistling softly. "You've got quite an animal there, Mrs. Thompson." I've seen wolfhounds and mastiffs, but nothing with that kind of grit." Winnie smiled, her hand resting on Bear's broad head. "He's a partner, sheriff, just like the rest of us." After the sheriff left with the prisoner, Kendrick and Winnie sat on the porch, watching the sun fully crest the horizon. The ranch felt different this morning, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The gather was nearly finished, the cattle were safe, and for the first time in his life, Kendrick Thompson felt like he was building a legacy that would outlast his own bones. "I was afraid for you," Kendrick said, staring out at the valley. "When I saw you on that ridge with a rifle, I realized that if anything happened to you, the walls of that house wouldn't matter. The land wouldn't matter. It would just be a pile of rocks again." Winnie took his hand, her fingers small but strong. "I won't stand by safe and useless while you face danger, Kendrick. We are partners. That means we face things together, the good and the bad." He looked at her, then, and saw the truth of her words in the steady green of her eyes. They weren't just a rancher and a bride. They were two people who had chosen to take a risk on a stranger and found a home in the process. Have you ever had a moment where you finally realized you weren't alone in your struggles? Or have you found a partner, whether human or animal, who showed you a level of loyalty you didn't think was possible? Leave a comment below and share your story. We read every one, and your experiences help build this community of the frontier heart. If you believe that partnership is the strongest defense against the world, hit that like button. The violence of the high range left a quietness in its wake that felt both profound and fragile. As August bled into September, the Thompson Ranch transitioned from the frantic energy of the gather into the slow, rhythmic labor of preparation. The rustlers had been silenced, the steers were sorted, and Kendrick had finally fixed the last of the fences that had been neglected during his years of solitary mourning. But the most significant change wasn't measured in head of cattle or miles of wire. It was measured in the warmth that now filled every room of the two-story house. Kendrick found himself standing in the hallway late one evening, his boots in his hand, staring at the closed door of the room he had prepared for Winifred. He had promised her he wouldn't presume, that he would wait for her to signal when, and if, she was ready for their marriage to move beyond the practical. He had lived in that house for 8 years, but it was only now, with the scent of lavender water drifting through the cracks in the floorboards and the soft, rhythmic snoring of Bear on the landing, that he realized how empty it had truly been. The door opened before he could turn away. Winnie stood there, her auburn hair unbraided and falling in waves over her shoulders. She looked at Kendrick, her green eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lamp she held. "The nights are getting colder, Kendrick," she said, her voice a low, steady current in the silence. "And this house is too large for two people to sleep in separate rooms." He felt a certainty flood through him that he hadn't known since the moment he stood on the platform in Hawthorne. He didn't say a word. He simply took the lamp from her hand and set it on the small table. That night, the covenant they had made in the small church became real in every sense. Kendrick had known women in his youth, brief, meaningless encounters that faded as quickly as the desert sun. But being with Winnie was different. It was an act of reclamation. It was two survivors finding wholeness in the touch of another's hand. As the fall deepened, Winnie took over the ranch accounts. Kendrick's record-keeping had always been a chaotic mess of crumpled receipts and ink-stained ledgers, but Winnie possessed a mind for numbers that rivaled his own instinct for cattle. She sat at the heavy oak desk in the parlor every evening, her pen scratching rhythmically as she organized a scattered world into a system that actually made sense. "You have a talent for this," Kendrick observed one night, leaning over her shoulder as Bear watched from his spot near the hearth. Winnie laughed, a bright, clear sound that always made his chest tighten. "My mother was a teacher, remember? She taught me that if you can't account for what you have, you don't really own it. You're just holding on to it until someone smarter comes along." But in mid-October, the rhythm of their life shifted again. Kendrick noticed a change in Winnie, a quietness that wasn't the silence of grief, but the stillness of someone listening to something he couldn't hear. She was eating less, and the morning coffee, which she usually savored, now made her turn away with a pale, strained expression. The realization hit Kendrick on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week the telegram had arrived all those months ago. He walked into the kitchen to find her sitting by the window, her hands resting on the ledger, her gaze fixed on the creek outside. "Winnie," he asked, his heart beginning a slow, heavy thrum. She turned to him, and the expression in her eyes was a mixture of joy and a terror, so sharp it mirrored his own. "I am late, Kendrick," she said simply. It took him a moment to understand, and then a wave of emotion crashed over him that he was entirely unprepared for. He pulled her into his lap, his large, calloused hands shaking as he held her. "A child?" he whispered. Winnie nodded, her face buried in his shoulder. "It is too early to be certain, but I feel it. A change. A beginning." Joy was his first instinct, but it was quickly followed by a cold, biting fear. The nearest doctor was in Carson City, a full day's ride away across a range that could turn lethal in a single snowstorm. Childbirth on the frontier was a gamble where the stakes were often the life of both mother and child. He looked at the walls he had built, at the land he had conquered, and realized that for all his strength, he could not protect her from the biology of survival. "I will keep you safe," he promised, though the words felt hollow in the face of the vast, unregulated wilderness around them. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Kendrick Thompson," Winnie reminded him, pulling back to look him in the eye. "I am healthy and I am strong. And I have you. And Bear." The massive dog seemed to sense the change immediately. He became Winnie's constant shadow, rarely leaving her side and positioning himself as a barrier between her and any perceived threat. Even, occasionally, Kendrick himself if he moved too quickly. Bear was no longer just a herding partner. He had appointed himself the guardian of the legacy that was now growing beneath Winnie's heart. The winter arrived with a mildness that Kendrick took as a blessing. They spent the long, dark evenings by the fire, reading aloud from the books Winnie had brought from Pennsylvania, tales of far-off lands and ancient histories that made their small corner of Nevada feel like the center of the world. They discussed names, imagining the person who would one day inherit this valley. "If it is a boy," Winnie said one night, her hand resting on her growing belly, "I would like to name him William Harper Thompson. After my father." Kendrick nodded, his eyes bright in the firelight. "And if it is a girl? Rose, maybe? After my mother." "Rose Marie Thompson," Winnie agreed, smiling. "But I suspect this child is a boy. He kicks like a mule." The breath of the future was now the primary current of the Thompson Ranch. They were no longer just building a home. They were building a dynasty. But as the first snow began to fall, dusting the Sierra peaks in pristine white, Kendrick lay awake, listening to the wind and the soft breathing of his wife. He knew that the hardest part of the frontier was yet to come. Have you ever been terrified by the very thing you wanted most? Or have you stood on the edge of a new life, realizing that your old world was gone forever? Leave a comment below and share your story. We are a family here on Western Desire, and your journey of grit and grace is what keeps this frontier alive. If you believe that a child is the ultimate legacy of love, hit that like button. The snow didn't just fall. It descended like a heavy, suffocating blanket of white silence, erasing the boundaries between the earth and the sky. Kendrick Thompson stood on the porch of the ranch house, the wood creaking under the weight of the accumulated drifts, and felt the bite of the Nevada winter deep in his marrow. It was mid-February, 1877, and the world had turned into a monochrome landscape of gray and silver. Behind him, the window was frosted over, but the warm, flickering glow of the hearth fire managed to penetrate the glass, a beacon of life in an otherwise frozen wilderness. He looked down at Bear. The massive Anatolian Shepherd was nearly invisible against the snow, his thick, cream-colored coat having grown even denser to combat the high desert chill. Bear was standing perfectly still, his ears twitching as he listened to the wind howling through the canyons. The dog didn't need to be told to be vigilant. The upcoming birth of the child had turned his ancient guardian instincts into something almost spiritual. He was no longer just Kendrick's herding partner. He was the sentry of the future. "The cattle are hunkered down in the south draws, Bear," Kendrick murmured, his breath a plume of white vapor. "They've got the hay we hauled, but this wind, it's a killer." Bear looked up at Kendrick, his intelligent brown eyes reflecting a deep understanding. He let out a low, comforting huff and leaned his heavy weight against Kendrick's leg. It was a gesture of solidarity. Kendrick reached down with a gloved hand and scratched the dog's ears, feeling the raw power in the animal's frame. He thought back to the day on the train platform in Hawthorne when he had first seen this beast. He had been so sure that a dog of this size would be a burden, a mouth to feed that offered nothing but companionship. He hadn't realized then that Bear would become the glue that held his new family together, the one who had already saved them from rustlers and now stood watch over the life growing inside Winifred. Kendrick stepped back inside, the warmth of the kitchen hitting him like a physical embrace. Winnie was sitting by the stove, her auburn hair catching the firelight. She was mending one of Kendrick's heavy woolen shirts, her fingers moving with a precision that never ceased to amaze him. She looked up and smiled, a soft, radiant expression that made the harshness of the storm outside feel 1,000 miles away. "The fences are holding?" she asked, her voice steady. "For now," Kendrick replied, removing his coat and hanging it by the door. "But I'll need to head out again tomorrow. The ice is building up on the creek, and I need to make sure the steers have a place to drink. I don't want them breaking legs on the slick spots." Winnie put down her sewing and placed a hand on her belly. The child, William, they hoped, was moving again. "He's restless tonight, Kendrick. I think he can hear the wind." Kendrick walked over and knelt beside her chair, placing his large, calloused hand over hers. He could feel the rhythmic, insistent thumping from within. It was a terrifying and beautiful thing, a life entirely dependent on their strength and the mercy of this unregulated frontier. He looked at the walls of the house, the stone and timber he had labored over for 8 years, and realized that they had never truly been tested until now. "I keep thinking about the doctor in Carson City," Kendrick admitted, the fear he'd been suppressing for weeks finally leaking into his voice. "If the baby comes early, if the passes are blocked. Winnie, it's a full day's ride, even in good weather." Winnie took his chin in her hand, forcing him to meet her green eyes. "Kendrick Thompson, look at me. I have survived a fire that took my world. I have scrubbed floors until my hand bled just to save enough for a train ticket to a man I didn't know. I am not a woman who breaks. Martha Dennison in town has delivered more babies than you have cattle, and she's already promised to come the moment the snow breaks." "I know," he whispered, "but I've spent my life losing the people I care about. My father, my mother. I don't know if I can survive it again." "You won't have to," she said firmly, "because we are partners, and partners don't leave each other behind." The winter was a study in endurance. They fell into a rhythm that was defined by the wood stove and the rising sun. Every morning, Kendrick and his hands, Hector and young Pete, would ride the perimeter, checking for cattle that had become trapped in the snow. Bear was always at the front, using his massive chest to plow through the drifts and his keen nose to find the scent of animals buried in the draws. On more than one occasion, the dog had saved a calf from freezing by simply standing over it and barking until the men arrived. In the evenings, the house was filled with the music of Winnie's voice. She would read to Kendrick from the books she had brought from Pennsylvania, tales of history and distant lands that made their small corner of Nevada feel part of a much larger story. She was teaching him that the frontier wasn't just a place to survive, it was a place to cultivate a mind. "Have you ever thought about what he'll be?" Winnie asked one night as the fire burned down to embers. "Our son, will he want the ranch, or will he want the world beyond the mountains?" Kendrick looked at the heavy oak table he had built. "I wanted to have the choice, Winnie. I built this place so he wouldn't have to start for nothing like I did. I want him to have the land in his blood, but the world in his head. Then we'll build a schoolroom," she decided, her eyes bright with the prospect. "We'll teach him and the children of the ranch hands and anyone else who wants to learn. A legacy isn't just about cattle, Kendrick. It's about knowledge." March arrived with a sudden, violent thaw. The snow turned to slush, and the creek, which had been a frozen ribbon, became a roaring torrent of ice and mud. The water source that made the land valuable was now a threat, threatening to wash away the lower corrals. Kendrick spent 3 days in the mud, working alongside Hector to reinforce the banks with stone and timber. He came home every night exhausted, covered in the gray, alkaline silt of the desert, but the sight of the house and the dog sitting on the porch gave him a second wind. Bear seemed to sense the change in the seasons. He was no longer plowing through snow. He was watching the horizon for the first signs of green. By late April, the high desert underwent its annual transformation. The brown, dormant sagebrush began to show tips of silver green, and the first of the wildflowers appeared, carpets of yellow and purple that turned the harsh landscape into something that looked like a dream. Winnie's time was drawing near. Kendrick had already sent young Pete into Hawthorne to alert Martha Dennison, and had prepared a room in the bunkhouse for her to stay in when the time came. The baby arrived on a warm evening in early May, just as the sun was setting behind the Sierra Peaks, painting the sky in the same shades of fire that had greeted Winnie on her first day. Kendrick paced the downstairs parlor, his hands trembling as he listened to the sounds coming from the bedroom above. Martha Dennison was there, her voice a calm, rhythmic murmur, and the doctor from Carson City had managed to make the ride just in case. Bear was at the bottom of the stairs. He wasn't barking or pacing. He was sitting with a dignified, alert stillness, his gaze fixed on the top of the landing. He was whining softly, a low, melodic sound of distress that mirrored Kendrick's own heart. The dog knew that the flock was being tested. He knew that the future of the Thompson ranch was hanging in the balance. The hours stretched into the night. Kendrick walked to the window, looking out at the valley. He could see the cattle grazing peacefully in the moonlight, a herd that had grown to nearly 400 head. He had everything a man could want: land, security, and a partnership built on the bedrock of trust. But as a thin, sharp wail finally cut through the silence of the house, Kendrick realized that none of it mattered compared to the sound of that single voice. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. A moment later, Martha appeared at the top of the stairs, a wide, tired smile on her weathered face. "You have a son, Mr. Thompson," she called out. "A healthy boy with a fine set of lungs. And your wife did beautifully. She's tired, but she's asking for you." Kendrick climbed the stairs on legs that felt like they were made of water. When he entered the room, the scent of lavender and sweat hit him, but it was the sight of Winnie that stopped him. She was propped up against the pillows, her auburn hair damp and tangled, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny, red bundle wrapped in one of the soft quilts his mother had made. "William Harper Thompson," she whispered as Kendrick sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "Say hello to your papa." Kendrick reached out a finger, and the baby's tiny hand immediately curled around it, gripping with a strength that took Kendrick's breath away. In that moment, the loneliness of the last 8 years was finally, truly erased. He looked at Winnie, then at the child, and finally at the dog who had nudged the door open and was now sitting at the foot of the bed, his intelligent eyes taking in the new member of his flock. "He's perfect," Kendrick whispered, tears blurring his vision. "You're both perfect." The Thompson Ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was a home. And as the sun began to rise over the valley, Kendrick realized that the greatest adventure of the frontier wasn't the gather or the fight. It was the quiet, steady build of a family. Have you ever felt a love so immediate and overwhelming that it changed the way you saw the world? Or have you stood watch over someone you loved, realizing that your own strength was only half of the story? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Every story of grit and grace helps us build this community of the West. If you believe that the legacy of a family is the real gold of the frontier, hit that like button. The year 1886 arrived with a stillness that seemed to settle over the valley like a long-awaited blessing. The Thompson Ranch had long since outgrown the original boundaries of that first 300 acres. Kendrick had purchased the land to the west, then the section to the north, doubling and then tripling the size of the operation. The house, too, had changed. Kendrick and Hector had added a new wing, a proper schoolroom where Winnie taught their children and the children of the ranch hands, her voice a steady, melodic rhythm that defined the afternoons. The sound of children laughing and the clatter of slate boards had replaced the hollow silence that once haunted these walls. At the center of it all was William. At 9 years old, he was the image of his father, dark-haired, steady-eyed, and built with a sturdy frame that suggested he would one day be a man of great strength. He followed Kendrick everywhere, learning the language of the land and the stubborn temperament of the cattle. But he had inherited Winnie's way with animals, a quiet, patient authority that commanded respect without the need for force. And then there was Bear. The Anatolian Shepherd was 12 years old now, a venerable patriarch of the ranch. His once thick, cream-colored coat was now peppered with white, especially around his muzzle and his intelligent brown eyes. He didn't lope across the range with the tireless energy he once had, but he was still the undisputed guardian of the flock. He spent most of his days resting in the shade of the cottonwood trees by the creek, his head held high, his gaze never far from Winnie or the children. The end came on a quiet summer night, the air smelling of sage and drying grass. Kendrick had gone out to the porch to find Bear stretched out in his favorite spot. The dog's tail had thumped once, a slow, weary greeting, and his eyes had met Kendrick's with a look of profound, peaceful completion. When Kendrick returned the next morning, Bear was still there, but the fire had left his eyes. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep, his muzzle resting on his paws, as if he were simply dreaming of the high range. The grief that swept through the ranch was a physical thing. William had cried as they shoveled the dry Nevada earth over the grave beneath the cottonwoods, his small shoulders shaking with the weight of his first real loss. Kendrick had stood with his hand on his son's shoulder, looking at the spot where the dog who had saved their lives now rested. He had a good life, William, Kendrick had said, his voice thick. He did work that mattered. He protected those he loved, and he was valued every single day. That is all any of us can ask for. They had placed a stone marker over the grave, and William had painstakingly carved the name Bear into the granite. It was the first of many such markers that would one day define the history of this family. The years that followed were defined by a different kind of growth. Rose Marie was born 3 years after William, a bright, auburn-haired girl who possessed Winnie's fire and Kendrick's pragmatism. 2 years after that, James arrived, a boy with a quick mind for numbers who would eventually take over the business side of the ranch, negotiating with buyers in San Francisco and Sacramento with a skill that made Kendrick shake his head in wonder. The ranch continued to prosper, but the greatest achievement wasn't the size of the herd or the number of acres. It was the legacy of partnership. Kendrick and Winnie were no longer the strangers who had met on a train platform. They were two halves of a single whole, their lives woven together by 1,000 small decisions and a few monumental risks. On their 20th wedding anniversary, in 1896, Kendrick took Winnie back to the creek. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and amber, the same light that had greeted her on her first day. They sat on the bench Kendrick had built beneath the largest cottonwood, their fingers laced together. Winnie's hair was touched with gray now, and the lines around her eyes were deeper, but to Kendrick, she was more beautiful than she had ever been. "Do you remember what I asked you here, all those years ago?" Kendrick asked, his voice low. "I remember," Winnie replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You asked if I missed Pennsylvania, and you said you missed what was, but that you could only move forward." Kendrick turned to her, his blue eyes bright with emotion. "Have you been happy moving forward with me, Winnie?" She looked at him, and the clarity in her green eyes was undiminished by the passing of 2 decades. "Kendrick Thompson, I've been happier than I ever dreamed possible. You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. You gave me love and partnership and a purpose that goes beyond just surviving. How could I be anything but grateful?" "I'm the grateful one," Kendrick said. "You walked into my life with your chin up and your dog at your side, and you transformed everything. You made a house into a home, a ranch into a legacy, and a lonely man into a husband and father. Every good thing in my life traces back to the day you arrived." Winnie stepped into his arms, fitting against him as perfectly as she had 20 years before. "We did well, didn't we? That stranger with a dog and the rancher who needed a herding partner. We did better than well." Kendrick agreed. We built something beautiful. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, listening to the water sing over the stones. In the distance, they could hear the voices of their children calling them back for supper, and the excited barking of Scout, the young border collie William had trained to take Bear's place. The cycle of the frontier was continuing, a steady, rhythmic progression of life and labor and love. The Thompson Ranch was no longer a solitary fortress against the wilderness. It was a community, a sanctuary, and a testament to the power of a second chance. Kendrick realized then that the Western desire wasn't for wealth or power or fame. It was the desire for a place to belong, for a partner to share the load, and for a legacy that would ripple forward through generations they would never meet. Have you ever had to say goodbye to a companion who wasn't just an animal, but a witness to your entire life's journey? Or have you reached a milestone in your life where you finally felt the full weight of the legacy you were building? Leave a comment below and share your story. Every voice adds a new thread to the fabric of this community. If you believe that the real gold of the frontier is the love we build along the way, hit that like button. The August night was warm, the air thick with the sweet, drying scent of summer grass and the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets. On the front porch of the Thompson Ranch, Kendrick and Winifred sat on the bench he had built 40 years prior, their hands entwined in a familiar, comfortable grip. The house was alive with the sounds of the celebration that had just concluded. The 40th wedding anniversary of the rancher who had needed help and the woman who had brought an oversized dog to answer his call. 40 years, Winnie marveled, her voice now a soft, weathered rasp that Kendrick found more beautiful than the clear chime it had been on the Hawthorne platform. It feels like yesterday and like a lifetime ago all at once. I remember exactly how the heat shimmered off the street when your train pulled in, Kendrick replied, his hair now a shock of silver white. I can barely remember what life was like before you. It's as if my real life didn't even start until you stepped off that locomotive. They had spent the evening surrounded by 3 generations of Thompsons. William, now 40 and the primary manager of the ranch, had implemented the breeding programs and land management systems his brother James had studied at university. Rosemarie and her husband, Daniel Pierce, had built a prosperous ranch of their own to the south, and their children, Kendrick's grandchildren, had spent the day running through the cottonwoods where Bear was buried. We were both starting over, Winnie said softly. I was desperate for a place to matter, to build something that couldn't be taken away by fire. I found all that and more with you. We found it together, Kendrick corrected. Neither of us could have built this life alone. It took both of us choosing each other every single day through the droughts and the rustlers and the winters that try to bury us. Over the last few months, they had embarked on a new project. Winnie's arthritis had made the ranch accounts difficult to manage, so they had turned their attention to documenting their journey. Kendrick provided the memories, the specific smell of the sage after the first rain, the weight of his Henry rifle during the Rustler raid, and Winnie wrote it all down in her neat teacher's hand. They had created a leather-bound book, a family heirloom they gave to each of their children, ensuring the story of the mail-order bride and the herding partner would never be lost to time. I'm not afraid of what comes next, Winnie had told him as they finished the final page of the book. I've had a life far better than I deserved. I just don't want you to be lonely again. Kendrick had squeezed her hand, mindful of the swollen joints. I will never be alone, Winnie. I have the family we built. And I have the certainty that a love like ours doesn't end just because the body wears out. We'll find each other again, on some new frontier. The end came for Winifred on a crisp spring morning in 1912. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, a slight smile on her face as if she were dreaming of the clear creek water. Kendrick woke to find her cold beside him, and for a moment, the world felt as silent and hollow as it had 8 years before she arrived. But the silence didn't last. Within the hour, William and Catherine were in the room, their strength a mirror of his own, and the grandchildren were there to surround him with the legacy Winnie had left behind. They buried her beneath the cottonwoods, next to Bear. The funeral was attended by over 200 people, a testament to the schoolroom she had built and the generations of Hawthorne children she had taught to read and write. Kendra visited her every day, sitting on the bench and talking to her about the cattle prices and the progress William was making with the new irrigation system. Kendrick followed her 5 years later, at the age of 74. He walked out to the creek one final summer evening, sat on the bench, and watched the sun paint the valley in familiar shades of gold and amber. He closed his eyes to rest for just a moment, and when he didn't wake, his family found him there, his face calm and untroubled. They buried him beside Winnie, and on the shared headstone, William had the words carved that they had lived by: Kendrick Thompson and Winifred Harper Thompson. Partners in love, in work, in life. Together again. The Thompson Ranch still stands today. Sometimes on quiet summer evenings when the light slants across the valley and the creek sings over the stones, the ranch hands swear they can see two figures sitting on the bench beneath the cottonwoods, hand in hand, watching the sunset together as they did for so many years. From a simple telegram, a woman with a too large dog, and a rancher who needed a partner, a dynasty had grown. It was a story built from courage and trust, a legend in Hawthorne that reminded everyone that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take a risk on love. Because from the most unlikely beginnings, the most beautiful futures can grow. Most people will finish this story and move on with their day, forgetting the weight of the frontier. But you are most people. If you believe that honor and legacy are worth more than gold, if you feel a responsibility to remember those who sacrificed to build the world you inhabit, hit that subscribe button. Don't let their fire go out in the darkness. We read every comment because this community is the living memory of the West. Share this story with someone who needs to know that it's never too late for a fresh start.